Alright guys, welcome to this video. It's called decision making, and my aim in this session is really to provide us with a sense of what decision making is and how it is achieved within organizations, different approaches, and possibly the pros and cons of the respective approaches that we would discuss. So a simple definition we could work with: decision making refers to selecting from among available options. Decision making refers to selecting from among available options. However, because in some cases our future is dependent on the quality of decisions we make, decision making may not necessarily be that simple. We want to take that into consideration. In terms of making decisions within organizations, a lot may be at stake. The future of the organization definitely is dependent on the quality of decisions that are made. The profitability, the satisfaction of stakeholders, the satisfaction of members of staff, the willingness of other stakeholders to do business with the organization. All these things are at stake in terms of the quality of decision making in relation to organizations. But having a decision to make or having a problem is not necessarily a bad thing. But in order to make decisions in a manner that the organization is better off as a result of the decisions we are making, we must now see problems as opportunities for us to really identify the gaps between a current state of performance and a preferred state of performance. And that's why James Allen said this: let a person rejoice when he's confronted with obstacles, for it means that the individual has reached the end of some particular line of indifference or folly and is now called upon to summon all his energy and his intelligence in order to extricate himself and to find a better way. That the powers within him are crying out for greater exercise and scope. And when you look at it from the perspective of an organization, it is simply to say, we as an organization, we have come to the end of a certain set of behaviors that we engaged in the past. We are now clear that these behaviors are not serving us. We are now clear that these behaviors or our current level of functioning would not take the organization where we want the organization to go. So we're clear on that. So this is an opportunity to be glad, to be delighted, because you now have no choice but to demand more of yourself, to demand more of your staff, to demand more of your decision making, such that you can take yourself away from the difficult circumstance and propel yourself in a better direction. Here's what Emmet Fox said: it is the law that any difficulties that can come to you at any time, no matter what they are, must be exactly what you need most at that moment to enable you to take the next step forward by overcoming them. The only real misfortune, the only real tragedy, comes when we suffer without learning the lesson. So problems are not necessarily bad things. Difficulties that we may be encountering are not necessarily a bad thing. The problem is if we do nothing about it, if we don't learn the lesson, or if we keep repeating mistakes of the past. So we want to take that into consideration as we groom ourselves, as we shape ourselves to become the future decision makers of our organization. Quality decision making helps us to reap the benefits of problems. Quality decision making helps us to reap the benefit of problems. If we are not making quality decisions, we're not going to benefit from problems, as described quite succinctly by Emmet Fox. So let's look at some approaches to decision making within organizations. Now we're going to talk about simple problems that we're faced with. There are different levels of problems or different kinds of problems within organizations. There are some problems that are referred to as wicked problems, and wicked problems are the ones that are extremely resistant to ordinary planning. They're extremely resistant, Sometimes there are no solutions to wicked problems sometimes, or sometimes the solution is quite difficult, quite intricate, and quite complicated. We're not talking about wicked problems in this discussion right now. We're talking about problems within the organization, that there are steps that can be taken once we got all the facts, once we ascertain exactly what's going on, how persons are affected, once we structure the problem, once we move from an ill-structured problem to a well-structured problem, we can bring a level of improvement to the situation. These are the kinds of problems we're going to be talking about now, and some approaches. And while we discuss these approaches here, we have to take into consideration that each of them may be useful at some points in time, and then they may not be as useful, or we may be at a disadvantage if we use them. So there are sometimes they're going to be advantages, and sometimes they're going to be disadvantages. So we need to get a clear sense of what they are and make a determination in under what circumstance they would be best suited. So let's look at decision making without consultation. So it is possible that decision making without consultation could be useful, and it's self-explanatory. Making a decision, a leader making a decision without the consultation of others, or a person making a decision without the consultation of others. And there are times when that could be useful, there are times when it could be optimal. So for example, when you have a time crunch, you're under pressure and a decision must be made, that might be an opportune time to make a decision without consultation. When you have all the information that you need to have, when you have the expertise and the requisite, when you have the requisite expertise in the area being discussed, it's okay to make a decision without consultation. But there may be some disadvantages and some drawbacks. For example, persons may disagree with the decision that you make, and these persons, their cooperation may be needed in order for you to carry out the decision in a way that redounds to the benefit of the organization. So that's one challenge, making a decision without consultation. All right. Second approach, decision making with consultation. And that's useful when you don't have all the pieces together, you don't have all the information, you may not necessarily have all the expertise required. So you have this conversation with other persons. In a lot of instances, persons stand to be affected by the decisions that you make. They would appreciate the fact that you consulted with them. And even if with the consultation, it doesn't mean that you're going to have to do what they say or go in the direction that they want you to go in, but at least you consulted them, and there would be a level of appreciation for the fact that they were consulted as part of the decision making process. So decision making with consultation may have its advantages, and of course there could be drawbacks as well, because sometimes, as I mentioned before, there could be a time crunch, and because of your time crunch, trying to consult with persons may not necessarily be the optimal decision there. There may be persons without the requisite expertise, but they just want their voices heard, and they want things to go their way, and that could actually confuse the situation. So there are some challenges there as well. Then you have decision by the majority rule. So we have a situation where no one decision may please everybody, and the stakes are such that you would need the cooperation you would need persons to be involved in executing the decision. So once you give persons the opportunity to make a decision, then you're likely to, for the very least, reduce the resistance that you would get from persons who are involved in carrying out the decision. And then there's decision by minority rule. And decision by minority rule, on the one hand, it could be looked at as high-handedness, where a small group of people just making all the decisions in their interests. It could be that. Or it could be, by minority rule, we have a group of persons who they have the expertise, they have the experience, they have the competence, they have the knowledge, they have the ability, and all the other attributes that would put them in a strong position to make certain kinds of decisions, because perhaps they can foresee some of the difficulties in other decisions being proposed. So you have this small group of individuals and they are making decisions on behalf of the organization or on behalf of the group simply because they are capable of making better quality decisions based on their knowledge, skills, abilities, and other attributes. And that's minority rule. Minority, a small group of people, notwithstanding the large group wants this, but a small group of people involved in making the decision. Then, of course, decision by expert. We don't have the requisite KSAOs, knowledge, skills, abilities, and other attributes. So we tap into the expert here, what the expert is saying, and allow the experts to be involved in the decision making. Allow what the expert is bringing to the table to be the dominant elements upon which the decisions are made. If we want to look at it from the perspective of the Ministry of Health's restrictions in terms of the pandemic, we're actually seeing where the Prime Minister, for better or for worse, is reliant on the experts and the information that the experts are bringing to the table as a basis for all the decisions that they would take. That's decision by expert. Obviously, there may be large numbers of persons disenfranchised, or there may be large numbers of persons dissatisfied with the quality of decisions being made, but a decision has been taken that decision by expert is the means of treating with this situation. And then, of course, you have decision by consensus. You are attempting to get everyone to be involved in the decision making process and everyone to contribute. And that has value because everybody feel as if they are part of everybody. Once you're part of the decision making, you're likely to be more invested in its success or in carrying out your functions in relation to the decisions that are taken. All right, but one of the things that you must, when you're going in the direction of consensus, you must ensure best as you can that persons are provided with an opportunity to be informed, to be educated, and to really be involved and invested in the process, because you're going to try to build that kind of consensus and everybody's view is going to be brought to bear. You want to ensure that the views being brought to bear are relevant ones that should be paid attention to. So these are some approaches to making simple, straightforward decisions within organizations, and there are other models that we would look at quite briefly. So there's the rational decision making model. And the rational decision making model is simply where you get information on alternatives, you gather all the information that you can on the alternatives, and we would talk about gathering information in a bit, and you examine that information to see the best possible course of action that can come out of it. Now, the rational decision making model, it's time consuming, but it's important if it's useful if the decisions that you have to make have serious consequences on the future of the organization. The decisions are important, and your goal is to maximize the outcome of the decision. So you use a rational model where you identify the problem, you identify all you can about the problem, you collect information from a variety of sources or methods, which we will talk about in a bit. You brainstorm possible solutions to the problems, and you identify a set of criteria by which your decisions would be made. You look at the elements that you would have to change. So that's the rational model, the rational process. And it's important when it's useful when the outcome has a lot of consequences and when you have time to engage in the process. That's the rational approach. And then you have the bounded rationality model. The minimum criteria are clear. So these are the things we want to get out of this decision making. You do not have, or you are not willing to invest much time to make the decision. You don't have all that time, but you're not necessarily trying to maximize the outcome. So you identify your minimum, what you want out of this situation, and you're bounded by that. I'm rational to the point that this is what I'm after in the situation, This is the amount of time I'm prepared to spend in this decision making context, and we're not necessarily going to have some severe consequences if we don't get this as right as we need to get it. So one of the worst things to do is spend a lot of time on things that we should be spending a little time on, and that's the bounded rationality approach. Saying to us essentially, we don't have to major in the minor. If something is not going to be seriously consequential, we don't necessarily have to engage in um, that extensive set of processes that would be time consuming, would have an opportunity cost, and the cost may outweigh the benefits, or the benefits simply would not be matched with the investment of time and energy and money and resources. And then there's the intuitive approach. And the intuitive approach is the goals are unclear. We are not necessarily clear on the goals. There's time pressure, and analysis paralysis would be costly. Analysis paralysis is simply we are analyzing and we're analyzing and we're collecting information and we're analyzing the findings and we're discussing these findings and we're making recommendations, but we're not taking action. We just in that cycle of getting information, discussing the information, making recommendations, and not taking action. So you could use the intuitive approach. We're not necessarily going to find the best answer. We don't necessarily have a clear sense of what the best answer is, but we know we have a situation that we have in our hands. We have experience in this situation. We have information in this situation, and we're going to make the best judgment call that we could make, given that the time has come for us to make a decision. And that's the intuitive model. And then we have the creative model. And the creative model, again, solutions to the problems are not clear. We're not necessarily clear what the solutions are. I mentioned a while ago wicked problems, and wicked problems don't necessarily have straight line solutions or clear cut solutions. So the solutions may not necessarily be clear. We might have exhausted a whole set of steps or avenues in attempting to treat with the problem with which we are faced. And we are now called upon to engage in a degree of what might be called wild storming. So we're just going way out on a limb trying to find ideas, even though the ideas are not necessarily tied to the straight line approach to solving problems. We're going way out. We need new solutions to be generated. We need a greater set of recommendations. And of course, we have the time to immerse ourselves in the issues so we could come up with the creative kinds of ideas that would allow us to see the problem differently and react differently to the problem rather than in ways that we have reacted previously. So these are some other models. We just talked about some approaches on the previous slides, and these are some other models, and in these cases we are talking about mainly simplistic problems with which the organization might be faced and decisions that we may have to make as a consequence of the problems we're encountering. So I mentioned a while ago there are different means by which we could capture the information which would allow us to make the decisions. We're saying here the quality of our decisions are often dependent on the quality of our information. So we may have to collect information from persons close to the situation, persons involved in the situation, or persons who may not necessarily be close to our situation, but they have context that they could bring to allow for greater clarity. We may have to collect information from those individuals. So collecting good quality information. There's an error on the slide here. It's supposed to be collecting good quality information. And we can look at it from the perspective of primary data. And primary data is simply data that we're collecting for our current purpose. Data that we're collecting to address our current concerns. So anything that we're doing to collect information, to gather information, to capture people's thoughts or their perspective or their views or their inputs, anything we're doing that's specific to our area of concern, that's primary information, and there are several ways that we can collect primary information. So one of the things we might want to consider is observation. So in collecting primary data, we can use observation, and observation could be as simple as, in an unobtrusive way, we're just looking at what's going on in the situation. We have to make a determination, as it says here, the 5 W's and the 1 H. 5 W's include who, what, where, when, why, and how. So if we are making a determination that observation is the means by which we would be gathering information or collecting quality information on the situation, can ask certain kinds of questions. Who are we going to be observing? What are we going to be observing? When are we going to be observing? Where are we going to be doing this observation? Why have we selected, and how? So these are, and you can ask the 5 W's and the 1 H in relation to all your data collection mode. You want to make better quality decisions, you need to have better quality information. You could get that information via observation. And observation, as I mentioned, could be unobtrusive, where we're not interfering with the process at all. We're just looking on in a sort of inconspicuous way, just looking on to what the situation is and taking our notes, filling out our checklist, as the case may be. And then we could have obtrusive observation, where we actually could be a part of the process, we're involved in the process, to have the feeling that persons would have who may be affected by the situation. Or we could be involved in different ways, where we're actually having conversations with persons who may be involved in the process, and they are aware that we are observing the process. Now, there will be advantages and disadvantages to obtrusive versus unobtrusive. Just like there would be advantages to observation and disadvantages to observation. Just like there would be advantages to primary data and disadvantages to primary data as well, where we may want to use secondary data, which we will talk about in a bit. Now, primary data has the benefit of being specifically tailor-made to our situation. That's one of the benefits why we might want to go in the direction of primary data. One of the disadvantages, it could be costly, it could be time consuming, and there are situations when we could have no time. A second means of data collection could be interviews. And interviews are essentially conversations that we're going to have with persons, with a person or persons, that would allow us to get their thoughts, get their views, get their perspective, see how they feel, see what they have to bring to bear on the situation. Again, we would ask the 5 W's and the 1 H. Who are we going to interview? When are we going to do it? Why are we going to do it? How are we going to do it? Where are we going to do it? Etc. Good? And interviews could be of different types. You have structured interviews, and a structured interview is, as the name says, it's a structure that we're going to follow. We have a prescribed set of questions. We're going to ask those questions in a specific order. We're going to try to get a response to each question in a particular order from everyone that we interview. And a structured interview is useful because we want to standardize the questions asked to different persons, regardless of when and where those questions are asked. Then we could have a semi-structured interview, where we're going to have a set of questions in a particular order, but we may not necessarily ask the questions in the order in which they are, or we may not necessarily ask all the questions that are on the interview questionnaire, or we may even include other questions that we didn't ask the previous people. And of course, there would be benefits to that kind of behavior. If you carried out an interview at first and then you discover this is a question that you should have asked, you can now include that question onto the second set of interviews that you're going to do. So it's a semi-structured interview approach, which allows for greater flexibility in getting the information that you need. It would take away from the standardization of the responses, but it would provide greater flexibility in getting better quality information within which you're going to make your decision. And then there are unstructured interviews. And unstructured interviews, you have a clear sense of what you want to talk about, but you are not going to um, restrict yourself to a particular set of questions that you identified, most and definitely not in any particular order. So it's unstructured. I'm going to ask a set of questions. Based on how you respond, I'm going to ask more questions. Based on what comes to mind while we're having this conversation, I'm going to just generate areas to probe consistent with the way the episode of communication is flowing. That's an unstructured interview. So we are talking about collecting the best quality information that we can within which to support our decision making. And we said that we could use observations, obtrusive and unobtrusive. We said we could use interviews, which could be structured, semi-structured, or unstructured. We could also use focus groups meetings. And focus groups meetings are essentially interviews with more than one person at the same time, with several persons who may have the answers that we are looking for in a specific area. So we have this group of individuals within this space, and we are probing the individuals collectively. And there are several advantages to using a focus group approach. One, you get a large amount of information from a large number of people at the same time in a small amount of time. So whereas if you have 25 persons in a focus group, just think about having 25 interviews to do the challenges associated with doing these 25 interviews. And if you're going to do 4 sets of focus group meetings, then you're going to have to do 4 by 25, which is 100 interviews. So there are benefits to using the focus group approach, but there are disadvantages as well, and we must be mindful of these disadvantages. For example, you could have a dominant voice in the focus group, one person who wants to answer all the questions. You could have groupthink. Everybody's thinking along the same line based on what one person is saying. People are just piggybacking on what was said before. You could have the shy person in the group who they're gonna have things that they can share and bring to bear, but they would not say anything because they're among others and they are shy. So you have to find a way to deal with all these challenges that may come about as a result of the focus group. The dominant voice, the guy who likes to hear himself and wants to talk more than everybody. The group think, where everybody's just going to be following a particular line that was introduced. Or you have the shy person. You're going to have to find a way to get that person involved in providing contributions to you as well. And then we have surveys as a means of collecting information, and surveys essentially questionnaires that we could distribute. There are several ways we could do surveys. We could do face-to-face surveys, we could do online surveys, we could do telephone surveys, we could do one-to-many surveys. There are different ways that surveys can be conducted. You would have to decide what's optimal given what you're trying to find out and the persons that you are targeting. One of the things you have to be skilled in is determining what kinds of questions would be on your questionnaire, on your survey questionnaire. So you may want to have open questions, and open questions are questions that allow for the respondent to give their thoughts, to be more qualitative, to express themselves. Whereas closed questions would be questions that restrict a person's response to perhaps one word or just a few words. For example, if I ask the question, do you think the government is handling the pandemic well? That's kind of a closed question, because the answer, if you say no, then I'd have to ask another question in order to get more information from you. So that's more or less a closed question. If you say yes, again, I'd have to ask another question in order to get more information. But if I ask, what are your thoughts on the government's handling of the pandemic? That's an open question. It allows you to be expressive and to be more qualitative in terms of sharing your views and your ideas in that regard. And then, of course, there are scale questions that you could include as well. Tell me, how do you feel about the government's handling of the pandemic? And use this scale to respond. You're very dissatisfied, or you're dissatisfied, or you're neutral. or you're satisfied or very satisfied. So it's a Likert scale that ranges from very dissatisfied on one extreme to very satisfied on another extreme, and of course ranges in between. So surveys are means by which you can collect information. So you're within an organization and you have a challenge of making the best quality decision that you can make. One of the means by which you could make good quality decisions is to access good quality information. And in accessing good quality information, there are several ways we could collect that information. And we just mentioned some of them here: observation, interviews, focus group meetings, and surveys. Now, you would want to discuss some of your findings against the backdrop of secondary data. Now, what's secondary data? Data collected for any other purpose, but it may be useful in helping you make sense of your findings and assist in the decision-making process. So you would have collected a certain amount of information. You would have derived certain findings from the information you would have received. You could now look at these findings against the backdrop of what was found in another study, in another area, in another country, in an earlier point in time, or something to that effect. So you could look at, well, this is what has been written about this situation in Europe. This is what applies in Asia. So this is likely to work for us. This wouldn't work for us because. So now we are reconciling our findings against findings from other time series or time spans or other jurisdictions, and using those discussions to assist in coming to certain kinds of conclusions and formulating appropriate recommendations to the challenge that we're encountering, all in the name of making better quality decisions. So there are some behaviors they encourage when we're making decisions, and of course if there are behaviors they encourage, there would be some behaviors to avoid. So some behaviors they encourage that would allow us to make better quality decisions. One, define the problem clearly. So we must not just be ready to make the first the decision that comes to mind, even though we may eventually go back to the first decision that came to mind, or the first recommendation, or the first suggestion. Even though we may eventually go back to that, we don't want to go with the first decision that comes to mind. We want to be able to be sure that we've defined the problem clearly. And in terms of defining the problem clearly, we want to have a clear identification of what the issue is, or the issues are. The issue is X, Y, or Z, as specific as we can be, as precise as we can be, as exact as we can be. This is the issue that we're discussing, with as far as practicable, objectively verifiable indicators. What's the evidence? What are the symptoms that make you realize that we have a problem? What's the evidence that you have? What sure signs that what has changed in this situation? What is different? What exactly is undesirable or unfavorable? So we have to define the problem with clarity. That's a behavior that we must encourage in making better quality decisions. Then step number 2, we're saying determine the cost of inaction versus the rewards for taking action. Is this a problem that I want to invest in? Is this a problem that I want to use a rational approach and take all this time? And is this a problem that I can just be intuitive with? Is this a problem that I have to be extremely patient with? Is this a problem that I will have to leave no stone unturned or be creative in trying to find a resolution? And one of the means by which we could deal with that situation is asking, what's the cost of inaction? What happens if we do nothing? If we are faced with this situation and we do nothing, what's the future of the organization like? How is the future going to be negatively impacted by this situation if we choose to do nothing about it? and you can juxtapose that with the rewards for taking action. So, how would the organization's future be better if we address this situation? How would things be better for employees? How would things be better for shareholders? How would things be better for our partners? How would things be better for our customers, our clients? How would things be better in relation to our corporate social responsibility? What are the rewards for taking action in relation to this problem? So we are getting a clear sense of the value in giving attention and resources to the problem. We've defined it, we're sure it exists because we have objectively verifiable indicators. We're now aware of the implications of the problem, the negative ways in which the organization would be impacted if we do nothing. Step 3, we brainstorm solutions as much as possible, as best as possible. What are the possible solutions? And we could get these solutions from persons when we do our primary data collection. So we could get persons' ideas, we could get ideas simply from the discussions that we're engaging in, dependent on persons' on the findings that we have. We could get better ideas from the secondary data that we're interacting with, the literature review we might conduct, the research that we might look at. And we could develop, and we're going to talk a little bit more about brainstorming on the next side, but brainstorming solutions is the next step. So we identify the problem and defined it. We analyze and clarify the problem. We looked at the cost of not doing anything versus the rewards for doing something. Now we're looking at all the possible things that we can do. And step 4, determine a basis for making a decision. What's the decision-making criteria, or what are the decision-making criteria? Is it going to be based on money? Is it going to be based on time? Is it going to be based on the resources that we have available? Is it going to be based on the expertise at our disposal? What's the basis for making this decision? So we brainstorm numerous ideas or possible recommendations to treat with the situation. Now, what's the basis upon which we're going to narrow down all these ideas that we have? Are we going to narrow down ideas on the basis of the likelihood of these ideas working? Or are we going to narrow down ideas based on what's going on in the external environment, or based on benchmarking what's going on with other organizations similar to us? What's the decision making? What are the decision making criteria that we're going to bring to bear on shortlisting all these ideas and recommendations that we have? We need to make a determination of that. Step 5, clearly identify the targets for change. So now that we've made the determination of the direction that we're likely to go, what are the targets for change? Is it going to be a change in personnel? Is it going to be a change in policy? Is it going to be a change in partners? Is it going to be a change in procedures, actions that we take? Is it going to be a change in terms of geography? So there are several things we may need to pay attention to in terms of the targets for change. Keep in mind that persons or employees within organizations are naturally resistant to change, and we would have to provide all the possible justification we can why we're embarking on a particular change within the organization. And again, all the previous steps would would be useful at this point, because we're now going to be able to convince them, educate them on the challenges that we're encountering, on the issues if we do nothing about it, and on all the other options, the strengths and the weaknesses, or the pros and the cons in relation to other options we've considered. So that is going to be extremely useful when we identify the change targets and we have to convince other persons within the organization of the change that we're going to make. Then determine the best means of implementation. How would the change be implemented? And this question could speak to the time frames. Are we going to do all at once? Are we going to take incremental step? It could be in relation to the size of the organization or the departments or the unit. Are we going to do one unit and then progress to a second unit, or one department and progress to a second department? And at what point would we be satisfied that enough persons are impacted or involved that we don't necessarily have to go forward? Things will take a momentum of its own. So we have to determine the best means of implementing the change towards the solution. And of course, we have to monitor and evaluate. And monitor is simply paying attention to the activities that we are required to do to see to what extent we are involved in doing those activities, to ensure that everybody is aware that of what they're supposed to do in the change. Everybody has the ability to do what they're supposed to do. Everybody is actually doing what they're supposed to do. And then, of course, we're going to look at evaluating the change. To what extent people's being aware, having the ability, and actually executing, to what extent are those variables making a difference in the results that we are getting within the organization, consistent with alleviating the problems with which we were faced previously, or with which what precipitated the need for addressing problems. So these are some behaviors to encourage in the decision-making process. Let's look at brainstorming real quickly. So we're going to talk in terms of brainstorming. There are some rules that you would want to consider in your whole brainstorming process. And some of the underlying dynamics, we talk about fluency, variability, originality, and utility. And let's get a good understanding. Fluency, quite simply, the number of ideas that we're coming up with in terms of the brainstorming activity. The more ideas, the better. Variability, we want to have some ideas that are different from each other. Flexibility, they can apply themselves in different ways, rather than all the ideas that we're coming up with are suffering from sameness. Originality, which speaks to creativity, ideas we've never really considered, recommendations we've never really considered. These are original ideas that we're bringing to bear here. And of course, utility, to what extent these ideas are really useful. So these are some things we would want to consider when we're setting up our brainstorming process: fluency, variability, originality, and utility. Real quickly, make time to brainstorm. So we actually have to make time to brainstorm. We have to make a determination that the solution that we're looking for is important enough that we could dedicate our staff a dedicated period of time to engage in the activity of brainstorming. Brainstorm alone and in groups with different audiences for different purposes. So sometimes you may want to have one department, let's say a focus group, and you're brainstorming with one department. Then you may want to brainstorm with another department to get a different set of ideas, a different quality of ideas. Then you may even want to consider combining groups from Department A and Department B together, and you're brainstorming with those groups together. Sometimes you may want to do your brainstorming with persons who have no idea what a good quality decision is in that regard. You just want to get those persons involved and see what you could get from them. And sometimes you may want to have just the experts involved in your brainstorming process. Write down all that comes to mind. Set extremely high quotas. So you're not necessarily encouraged to set idea quotas, but if you're going to set high quotas, rather than saying, I want one idea from everybody, you could say, I'm going to take 10 ideas from everybody. You can set extremely high quotas. It doesn't matter if people repeat stuff, if people write down things that doesn't make sense, or things that other persons would have written down, that's all right. Do not judge the ideas just yet. Even practice while storming, which I just mentioned there. So at this point, we're not going to judge ideas. We're collecting ideas at this point. While storming would even be useful, which would be far-fetched ideas that may not even work. But I'm happy to hear those, because they may, in the discussions of while storming, they may put us on a path to something that we would have never thought of if we didn't engage in that activity. It's okay to write an idea more than once. I just mentioned that. When you run out of ideas, try to get just one more, because we're pushing the envelope trying to get the best possible ideas. Go to the literature, go to best practices, read up, and while you're brainstorming, the literature would help you to get more and better ideas. Encourage questions when brainstorming as a group. Review all possible options. Feel free to change your mind. Ask for clarification. If you do not understand what somebody is contributing, ask for clarification. Ask, what have we missed? Ask, why do you think this might work? Ask, why do you think this might not work? Play the devil's advocate. And the devil's advocate is simply that individual who can tell you all the reasons why it would not work. It does not make sense. It is useless. So you can have that devil's advocate as part of your group, or you can play the devil's advocate, because when you attempt to rebut what the devil's advocate is saying to you, you get better quality ideas. And it's that kind of, that meshing, that friction between what you think might work and what somebody else is saying to you definitely would not work. That dynamic, that friction there, that may produce the solutions that you are after, which would allow for better quality decisions. Implementing a solution. Some of the things that we could consider: identify as many reasonable alternative solutions to the problem, which we just talked about that. Identify the important criteria for evaluating each alternative, which we just talked about that. Is it money? Is it time? Is it expertise? Test each alternative solution with the criteria. Determine if one alternative appears more feasible or more reasonable than others. If necessary, test your reasoning and preferred solution on others. We talk about that. List the major action steps that you are going to take in terms of implementation. Describe these steps in the order you expect to take them, you expect them to occur. Identify the authority that you may require to proceed with the solution that you want to go forward with. So you may have to get your approval at different levels in order to go forward with certain kinds of decisions. What key groups of individuals would you have to involve? What resources and support are needed? What are the major stumbling blocks or obstacles that need to be overcome? What are the first steps to be taken? Who will initiate action? Who needs to be kept informed? When do we reevaluate? As we speak, I am currently working on a process with an organization, and I'm actually at this stage here where we're trying to work out some of the ideas, the creative ideas that we've come up with. We're actually trying to work out their implementation as we speak. So these are extremely useful and practical considerations in implementing a solution. Some behaviors that are inimical to the success of decision making, or the getting to the best quality decision. Some things, behaviors to avoid, some things we should not engage in. We've tried that before. Negative statement. Just right. We evaluate it at the point when it's optimal. It would take too long. It would cost too much. That's not my job. It's impossible. That's a stupid idea. That's not important. We don't need any more information. We already have the facts. It's not broken. Don't fix it. This is still a bureaucracy. I'm still the boss because I said so. That's not how we do it here. I've been working with organizations, and these are some of the responses that you get when you attempt to put solutions down, especially organizations within the protective services, These are some of the responses, and these are inimical to progress. Anchoring. And anchoring is where you're going to have a lot of variables that you could pay attention to, but you're going to drop your anchor on this one variable because it provides perhaps the most strength in terms of your argument why something would not work. We need to look at the big picture. We need to look at all the variables and give them equal attention. Anchoring is something that we should avoid. Confirmation bias. And confirmation bias is basically you're interpreting the information to suit your objective. Whatever objective you want to come out of it, whatever agenda you may have, you're interpreting ambiguous information or information that is in between, that is not 100% one way or another. You're interpreting that in a particular way to suit your objectives. And some elements of confirmation bias include causal ambiguity. You don't know the cause, you're ambiguous, you're doubtful of what the cause is, but you're going to say it's what you want it to be. Belief persistence. And belief persistence is something that you believe at the beginning of the discussion. You're seeing evidence to the contrary, but you're continuing to believe what you believed at the beginning simply because that's who you are. Polarization is another confirmation bias, and if you're polarized in one way, you're gonna see things in that way regardless of the evidence that you're presented with. Let me give you an example. Might not necessarily be the best example, but if we look at our politics, we have PNM and we have the UNC, and then persons who may side with the UNC may be seeing the good that the PNM is doing, and they're polarized such that they do not allow themselves to say those things that would cause the PNM to show up well, and vice versa. Persons in the PNM may not allow themselves to say things that would allow the UNC to look well or to show up well, and these may be the best quality decisions that we can make. Then we have framing bias, and framing bias is essentially the information is framed in a particular way that can cause you to feel a particular way based on hearing it said in that way, or you're saying it in a way that would cause persons to react to it in a favorable way rather than really stating the situation as it is. Let me give you an example. I'm going to try to give you an example. If I want you to buy a product that I'm selling, and you are a health conscious individual, and I know that my product has 15% fat, instead of saying 15% fat, I don't want to talk about fat with you. I might say something like 85% lean meat, 85% lean meat. And you might be, oh, 85% lean meat, 85% is a lot. But I framed it in that way. If I said 15% fat, you're going to say, oh, 15% fat is still a lot because it's fat and you don't really want it. So based on how it is framed, you have that kind of bias, and you make decisions based on that bias. You have to be mindful of that. That's a behavior to avoid. Escalation of commitment. And escalation of commitment is along the lines of belief persistence, or not necessarily belief persistence, but because I said something at the beginning, I want to appear consistent with the person that I was when I said what I said. So I'm going to not necessarily go away from the decision that I made or the position that I held. I'm going to try to keep building on that position as we go along in the process, even though I come to the realization that what I was saying was not necessarily accurate or is not necessarily the best thing to consider in this context. Because I have this resistance to admitting that I'm wrong, I can just continue along those lines and looking for all the reasons that support the position that I previously espoused. And then, of course, the sunk cost fallacy is when we've already spent so much money, we've already spent so much time, we've already gone in this direction. You know what? We already did all of this. Let's just continue. That's a poor basis for decision making. Simply saying that we've invested so much. Just think about it this way: if you've invested all you can and you prepare and you decide to go onto a ship to go to a particular destination, and then you realize that everything that you did was wrong, all your planning, you did a lot of planning, you spent a lot of money, would you continue on the ship going in the direction that you were going, knowing that you're going in the wrong direction? So that's the sunk cost fallacy. People tend to think that we've already invested so much, let's just go through with it, and that is not necessarily a good basis for decision making. Good. Now, I want us to turn our direction real quickly to making some tough decisions based on ethical situations, and we would end this presentation here. We'd end this discussion when we discuss these areas. We are now on about 55 minutes. We're going to probably go for the next 10 to 12 minutes or so, so just bear with me. Good? Making tough decisions. All right, so there are several bases for ethical reasoning or making ethical decisions or treating with ethical dilemmas or treating with defining moments. Let me give you a quick understanding of um, ethical decisions, ethical dilemmas, and defining moments. Now, an ethical decision is something that we know to be right or something that we know to be wrong. It's a straight decision. We know this to be wrong and we make a decision to do it. That's unethical. We know it to be right and we make the decision to do it. The right thing, that's ethical. That's an ethical decision. An ethical dilemma is a situation where we have to make a decision and we're not clear on what's right or wrong in the situation. There are gray areas. Any decision we make could cause harm, or one decision could be good and another decision could be better. So we're in that kind of ethical dilemma. We really don't know which way to go. That's an ethical dilemma. And a defining moment is when we're faced with an ethical dilemma, and whatever decision we make, it's going to have an impact on the future of the organization. It's going to have an impact on our lives. It's going to have an impact on what the future would be for all the stakeholders involved. That's a defining moment. So we want to talk about ethical reasoning in ethical dilemmas or defining moments as a basis for making decisions. And we're not going to go in any real details. I'm just going to go through this real quickly and just enough for us to understand that these are some things that we could consider. One is your hegemon. And hegemon is simply a term that says that which rules over others. That which rules over others. So in our minds, sometimes when we're faced with ethical dilemmas or tough decisions that we need to make, in our minds we have a sense of the criteria or a set of criteria against which we're going to weigh our decisions. In some cases it could be money. I'm going to make all my decisions dependent on money. In some cases it could be power. I'm going to make all my decisions based on power. In some cases it could be status and recognition. In some cases it could be other-mindedness. I'm doing this because I care about other stakeholders in this whole mix. In some cases it could be self-preservation. I'm protecting myself in this context. All right, so there are different bases that we may want to use in terms of making a decision. Now, hegemon is that which rules over others. So which of these bases or which of these criteria we're going to put as our number one criterion? Essentially, when faced with a tough decision, the number one criterion that we go to against all criteria is determined as our hegemon. So some people can say my hegemon is other-mindedness. In all my decisions, I'm going to think about others and how they're going to be impacted by it. As a leader, that's how you might want to be. Some people might say that in all my decisions, my personal well-being, my future, it's all about me, my self-interest. And as we were discussing a bit, you operate at a level of punishment avoidance and reward seeking. As a leader, that may not necessarily be the best way to do things. So hegemon is essentially, of all these things going through my mind, this is the number one upon which I'm going to make a decision. This is the number one criterion upon which I'm going to make a decision. And that's one means of dealing with tough decisions. A second thing we could look at is stages of moral development, our stage of moral maturity. And there's some research that points in certain direction that says we operate at one of 6 stages. And these 6 stages, the first stage is punishment avoidance. So there are some persons that make decisions on the basis of punishment avoidance. There are some persons that make decisions on the basis of reward seeking. That's level 1, stage 1 and 2. Stage 1, punishment avoidance. Stage 2, reward seeking. Is that a good basis for making a decision? Is that a good criteria? Are those good criteria for making decisions? Punishment avoidance and reward seeking. That's considered the self interest approach. And then there's stage 3, which is considered the good person. I am a good person, and good people don't do bad things. So all my decisions would be made from me being a good person. I want to be seen as a good person. I want to be a good person. So my decisions are, once I'm happy with this decision that I'm going to make, I'm going to be seen as a good person. This is all I'm concerned about. But sometimes you're faced with tough decisions and you really cannot afford to be a good person in making that decision. Sometimes. And then we have law and order, which is the 4th stage that people reason at. What does the book say? What does the law say? What does the Bible say? What does the scripture say? What does the policy say? What do we have in place? So all your decisions are based on rules and policies and regulations and precepts that were predetermined or prescribed and presented. So a person of that nature may not necessarily be making high quality decisions when faced with tough challenges or moral creativity is required to extricate themselves from a difficult situation. They may not necessarily be ideal or optimal. This is just something to consider. And the 5th stage would be social contracting. And social contracting is essentially, you know what, we are now faced with a tough situation. Yes, there are precepts in place. Yes, there are policies in place. Yes, we've done things in this way in the past. Yes, this is the way we've been indoctrinated, or we are prescribed to be behaving, but it's a different situation. Let's come together, have a discussion, and see what's best in this context. The situation has changed. Let's come together and have a conversation and see what's best given the changes that we are now attempting to treat with. And that's the social contracting model. Disobeying wrong rules, disobeying things that are no longer useful, and making a decision based on the stakeholders involved and how we think we should treat with the situation given developments. And then the 6th stage of that model is the universalism, or the universal approach. And the universal approach, which we will talk about universalism in a bit again, but it says, as a matter of fact, it might be a perfect segue into universalism. And universalism says that we are duty bound to behave in a particular way that is fair to all mankind. Universally, we must do the right thing. The right thing is the right thing, and we are duty bound to do the right thing. We must not do things that are wrong, so we must be respectful, we must be fair. Honesty is the best policy. So there's a way to behave that would allow us to receive the blessings, and we must always behave in those ways in all situations. So in universalism, there are what you call categorical imperative. Categorical imperative says the right thing is the right thing, and we are duty bound to do the right thing. Even if doing the wrong thing would produce the greatest good for the greatest number of people, we are duty bound to do the right thing. We must always do what is right. That's the universalist perspective. Versus hypothetical imperative. And hypothetical imperatives, they are more tied to utilitarianism. And utilitarianism says the end justifies the means. So we are going to weigh the usefulness of this decision by the consequence or by the results, not necessarily by the act itself, but by the consequences that would follow or by the results that we would get. And they refer to as hypothetical imperative. The end justifies the means. So for example, in categorical imperative, part of universalism, it says, it is wrong to steal, thou shalt not steal. In utilitarianism, hypothetical imperative, it says, if a person steals to save the life of another, then stealing was a good decision. You stole and you saved a life. So somebody steals medicine from a pharmacy, and that medicine that was stolen was involved in saving the lives of individuals, then stealing was a good decision. And now keep in mind, I am not saying what is right or what is wrong. I'm just trying to help us understand the concepts. So you have universalism that says the right thing is the right thing and we must always do the right thing. And we have utilitarianism that says, hey, look at the utility or the usefulness that you're getting from your decision, and that must be the basis for making your decision. And then we have, as a final basis for ethical reasoning, we have ethics of noble cause. And ethics of noble cause can be described as noble cause corruption. We are behaving in an unethical way because society stands to benefit from our behavior. That's my basis for decision making. I am going to use a fake warrant to go in a known offender's house. Even though it's unethical, I'm likely to find drugs and guns and be able to get these drugs and guns off the street, or be able to put away a known felon. If I plant drugs or guns, I know this person is untouchable, and if I behave in an unethical way and give them a gun or plant drugs in their house, I can get them off the streets for a while. So I know I'm going to be behaving unethical, but I'm behaving unethical for a noble cause, and that's called ethics of noble cause, and that too is a basis for making a tough decision. So on this slide, essentially, we've discussed the basis for making tough decisions, some approaches, some things to consider, your hegemon, what's your dominant criterion that you would use when faced with an extremely tough situation. If it's other-mindedness, it means that you care about the well-being of humanity and you're going to make all your decisions on that basis. If it's self-preservation, if it's status, if it's recognition, if it's power, that's all reward-seeking, and it may not necessarily be the highest quality decision. We also talked about stages of moral development, and we looked at 6 stages, from punishment avoidance, reward-seeking, the desire to be a good person, the desire to follow law and order, social contracting, and universalism. You can make a determination at what level it's useful given the situation that you find yourself in, taking into consideration there would be pros and cons of each. We talked about the universalist approach, which we say you're duty bound to do the right thing. Categorically, you must always try to do the right thing. And then we talked about utilitarianism, and utilitarianism says the end justifies the means. And then we talk about ethics of noble cause. The end justifies the means in the context of protecting society from undesirables. So these are some bases that I would recommend you try to read up more on, you try to do more research on, and you even try to give yourself some practice in implementing them in your decision-making processes. A couple key questions. It says two key questions, but several questions that you may want to consider in making your decision when faced with an extremely tough decision. On this slide, there were 2 questions, and I increased them. I added some more questions because I think they are useful. So it's a typographical error there. There should actually be key questions or useful questions. And when faced with an extremely tough decision to make within an organization, as a person who is making a decision that would impact the future of the organization, that would impact the livelihood or safety or well-being of other persons within the equation, these are some questions that you could ask as we bring this video to a close. Am I bringing to bear the best quality information that I can access? And we talked about primary information and secondary information. To whom and to what do I owe my loyalty in this situation? That's a question that we need to answer. In terms of the other-mindedness, when I'm thinking of others, who are those others? Question 3, am I operating with a spirit of the public good? So if I make this decision, is this a decision that is in the interest of the public good? Or is it in my own interest? I need to be clear on that. Who could be hurt by my decision? Which is one of the questions I was here originally. When I make this decision, who can be hurt by my decision? Am I confident that my decision would be valid over the long term. So if I really want peace to come out of this, or profit to come out of this over the long term, would peace really come out? Would profit really come out of this decision here? Let's take, for example, if we have a situation of an airline that is losing money, and the government decides, you know what, I want to rescue the country from using money from the treasury to look after this airline. You might do that, but then without the airline, you would put the country under additional kinds of problems over the long term. So these are some things you would consider in your decision making. What would you say to your child in such a situation? I put that question here because sometimes we may be in situations and we're going to say, you know what, we're going to slug it out. But sometimes when you think of your son or daughter, if they're in that situation, what would you tell them to do? I give an example in a previous class of a person stranded on an island, and the only way to get off the island was to compromise something that you believe in so much, and that's your only means of getting off the island. And lots of people say, no, I would not compromise myself, I would stay on the island even if it means that I would die. And then I say, well, what would you tell your child to do if they were on the island? You were safe at home, they were on the island, what would you tell them to do? And then, yes, okay, compromise your values. So when you think of it from that perspective, you tend to get a different perspective at minimum. And then the final question, which is a question that was on the slide, is this a decision I can live with? So once I've made these decisions, could I sleep well at night knowing that I did the best that I can? So guys, the best we could do is the best we can do. My intention was for this video to be an hour. It's now an hour and 11 minutes. I hope you got value from it, and all the best with your efforts to become intelligent decision makers on behalf of your organizations. All the best.